Okay, can you say something?
Yep, I can talk about random topics like quantum tunneling.
Oh yeah, talk a little bit about quantum tunneling. I'm genuinely
Yeah,
interested.
basically, I got into a footnote earlier today about what's the probability of one amino acid tunneling through another amino acid, and I calculated that the probability is e to the power of minus 3,000, whereabouts. That is, it never happens in
Yeah,
practice.
it's never
Now, on the
happened
other
in the
hand, for an
universe.
electron,
Interesting. Okay, I think everything should be working properly now. Say one more thing. This is very bizarre. The audio input is, let's see, create output projector, recording output projector properties. Um, okay, and one more thing.
yep,
There we go. Perfect. Okay, we're all good.
yep.
Um, right. Now that we've got that working, I'm not sure what was up there. Audio problems. Anyway, um, now that we've got that working, so you can see my document here. Um, Basically, what I've got going on is I'm discussing existential risk live with a couple of streamers, including quite a popular one on Friday called
Yep.
Destiny. And he is so he's a uh, I think his base ethical foundation is kind of rational egoism,
Hmm.
um, but he's very sympathetic to rule utilitarian kind of based arguments, and that's probably his main the main thrust of his ethical worldview. And I have specifically challenged him on the claim that he's made previously, which I don't think he's made like super strongly, but nonetheless it's quite a good thing for me to hook the argument onto the claim that climate change and thermonuclear war are the two greatest existential threats facing humanity. Which, of course, as we learn from your colleague Toby Ord's recent excellent book, The Precipice, uh, though both of those are concerning risks and things that we should be worried about and should be taking efforts to mitigate, and certainly they pose many worrying risks that don't rise to the level of an existential threat, but are nonetheless concerning. Despite that fact, they are probably at least an order of magnitude less likely to wipe us all out or erase the future flourishing of our species than uh, more novel anthropogenic risks, such as um, uh, novel biorisks, so engineered pandemics, artificial general intelligence, possibly things like nanotechnology, um, possibly totalitarianism. So there are these emerging technological risks, maybe leaving aside totalitarianism because that's a little bit complex, but these emerging technological risks that are substantially more worrying from the point of view of the kind of long-term perspective than um, the more traditional technological risks, i.e., climate change and nuclear war, which are in turn far more concerning, far more likely to wipe us out than a lot of the most prominent um, natural risks, things like asteroid attacks, which are it's something that was really quite reassuring reading The Precipice is that we're almost certainly not going to get wiped out by an asteroid. I mean, it's still something we want to pay attention to, and something we don't want to completely neglect. But over the next century or so, we're looking at like 1 in 10,000 maybe, um, which is
And same thing, or even lower, of course, for supervolcanoes and supernovas and gamma ray bursts and things like that.
which was very reassuring to me because gamma ray bursts is something that have previously worried me a fair bit. But reading up that it's probably caused some atmospheric disruption, but unless we're really close, it's probably not going to wipe us all out. Um, so that's a real ray of sunshine. I mean that unironically. Like it's good finding out that things are less likely to destroy us than I thought. Um, so that's my first argument is specifically that, or I'm going to drill down into biorisk, engineered pandemics, because it's an area I'm more familiar with. Um, Artificial intelligence is a really interesting one. I think there's good reason to believe that it's an even greater threat than engineered pandemics, but it takes quite a while to unpack, and I'm not an expert. Um, Plus, I think when it comes to kind of public messaging, it's often difficult to concisely present AI because it's so outside of our kind of field of experience, and there's also so much like alarmist media that everyone goes, Terminator. You think Terminator's going to happen, which is it's easier to explain with pandemics. I think particularly in the light of COVID.
Yeah. After all, it doesn't take that much to point out that even in the coronavirus family, there are some rather nasty ones. We kind of got lucky here. It could have had the case fatality rate of MERS instead, and then we would be in real trouble.
Yeah, so MERS, I think was what, like 60% or something,
Mm.
somewhere in that region, which is very, very bad. That's I mean, it's a little bit off, but not too far from, Ebola and these kind of very, very worrying hemorrhagic fevers. And the saving grace of MERS is the fact that its transmissibility is extremely low, which is why only a few hundred people or so I think have got it. Um, but
And generally, it doesn't transmit very well between humans, so let's
mm,
keep it like that, because you still got this the circulating MERS viruses among the camels.
yeah,
The scary thing is, of course, bioengineering stuff, especially when you can make it nastier, and that is, of course, getting easier. But I'm wondering about your general line of argument here, because it seems like many of the long-termist arguments require you to be a long-termist to buy them.
mm,
So we have various existential risks, which are slow burning things. But if you're a rational egoist, you might actually care about your own lifetime.
mm,
Now, of course, hopefully we can convince your opponent that life extension is around the corner and he might actually have a very, very long life to deal with. But still, it seems like there is something important to be said here about the time ordering of risks, because I think that's another thing people get really confused about.
could you speak a little bit more about that? What do you?
Mm. Uh, so right now, I think the total amount of existential risk from AI is essentially zero. And the risk from bioweapons is relatively low, but going up. Meanwhile, the risk from the nuclear weapons is there, and is actually quite a sizable chunk of risk right now. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, that the nuclear weapon risk is kind of ongoing. And in some sense, if there was a very high risk of nuclear war, it would reduce the risk of us getting killed by super intelligence or bioweapons, because we would be killed by the mushroom clouds before. There is this ironic thing that nuclear war, in some sense, reduces the risk of bad AI.
Because
And
it's like more likely to wipe us all out, and
yeah, if it had been super dangerous and a high probability, then that would probably get us before some of the other ones. If we, on the other hand, kind of reduce a lot of risks, wait long enough, and sooner or later you're going to get a gamma ray burst in your vicinity. So you get this time ordering effect. So you have the risk that right now are a problem, and then, of course, if you wait long enough, they're likely to happen. However, other risks might become more likely over time. So I think the bio risk is interesting. on one hand, it might be going up because we have a more globalized world, more people around with more animals. But you also have various risks of biotechnology, and they might make it easier to make dangerous pathogens. Uh, so that means that you do have a kind of temporal spectrum. It's going to take a while before AI gets good enough to be really dangerous. Although, of course, some of my colleagues think that they're pessimistic in the sense that they think AI is developing much faster than most people expect.
We had
I'm actually the AI skeptic around the office, which they make them say, "You're an optimist, Anders."
so what would your on a sort of side note there, what would your kind of median projection for when we get say human level general purpose AI?
I ended up with my median somewhere around 2080, but there is a tremendous variance in this estimate because we actually don't have any good way of making good estimates of it.
Mm.
So
I
this
had
is, of course, where climate is kind of nice, actually. Yeah, we have really uncertain climate models, but we roughly know the time constant of climatic change. We roughly know how quickly we can change things in human society. So we can kind of make forecasts that it's going to take a bunch of decades before things get really nasty if it's really bad. And you can actually get a sense of a time scale. So in some sense, also, of course, nuclear war is a protector against climate change. I'm starting to be warm on nuclear war here, but the problem is, of course, that you want to think about your priority setting. It might be easier to fix climate, or it might be easier to fix nuclear war, or it might be easier to fix AI, and you want to invest in the right way. So in the end, the real argument is, where do we put our effort? And I think a lot of people have this naive idea that there is only a fixed budget of effort to fixing big problems in the world, and it has to go to the most urgent thing. I remember somebody giving a bad review to Nick Bostrom's book on global catastrophic risk, saying that why is he bringing up all these other threats when climate change is the biggest?
that would be this one, I believe.
Yep, that it's a brilliant book.
Well
It's
worth it.
really good.
Yeah. Um,
And it really annoyed that particular reviewer because that reviewer were thinking that, oh, we need to convince everybody that climate change is the biggest and most important thing. And then these guys are coming up with other things that might also merit stuff. That's bad. In
yeah,
practice, of course, the medical world are working on the pandemics. They are not going to be terribly helpful for fixing carbon emissions. And the carbon emissions and solar power people are probably really lousy in the lab, as far as I know it, when it comes to pathogens.
that's an excellent point.
So I think it was Steven Pinker, for example, who
Mm.
felt that, oh, talking about AI risk is stupid because people have only a fixed amount of worry and it should be all spent on climate. Which
I
again, I think is a stupid general view. I think it's somewhat true, however, that we do have a worry budget. But if your actions to fix the world are totally dependent on having enough people worried about a particular thing, then you're a little bit too much populist in fixing the world.
mm,
Ideally, you want experts fixing really boring things that only experts care about, and then the public might not even care too much about that. That's a good division of labor too.
yeah. Um, absolutely. And I figure though that part of what something I'm trying to do with kind of this debate is get a lot of these ideas a bit more. Or I'm not arrogant enough to think this debate is going to make any major changes, but gradually percolating some of those ideas out there because currently the experts just don't have enough support from institutions. And the way that
Yeah.
institutions provide support is with public support for their providing support. Um, and
At this point, you know I'm going to bring up Hayek's The Intellectuals and Socialism.
go for it.
Yep. So I don't know if you know about this. This was an essay written, I think, in 1945 or so.
Mm.
So Friedrich von Hayek, one of the founders of neoliberalism, the all-around Central European genius, he was kind of annoyed that the rest of the faculty at the university were all socialists. He was convinced that they're totally wrong about everything. And then he started wondering, but how come smart people believe in these kind of wrong things? So he kind of invented memetics in the 1940s. So in the essay, he argues that what's happening actually in society is that you have a class of people who are second-hand dealers of ideas. They're not necessarily the ones who come up with the really new ideas, but they're the ones talking about them. And they involve, of course, most of us in the faculty at universities, but also teachers and journalists and pundits. And today he would, of course, be bringing up everybody doing podcasts,
Mm.
etc. And the thing is, these second-hand dealers of ideas, they talk about ideas, they criticize ideas, they spread ideas, and then people listen to them and quite often absorb these ideas and think that's how things are.
Mm.
So in the essay, Hayek was kind of analyzing why he thought socialism had dominated this class of intellectuals. And part of it is that it kind of pets them and says, oh yes, you're the vanguard, you're really important for the coming revolution, and then you're going to have a glorious position. Of course, in practice, it didn't turn out that well for the real intellectuals in the Soviet Union or
Yeah.
anywhere else, but that's irrelevant for the spread of that idea.
Mm.
Um, and in general, of course, once you get your ideas dominant in the intellectual circles, then the intellectuals are going to tell everybody solemnly this is the way it is in all sorts of forms, whether that's a podcast or a fancy report to the prime minister, and keep on doing that long enough and everybody will be convinced.
Mm.
It's worth noticing that Hayek and his friends formed the Mount Pelerin Society to spread neoliberalism, and they succeeded fairly well with that. But it took them a few decades, but they actually followed the basic blueprint here. And I think this goes, generally, the classic liberal idea is, of course, the marketplace of ideas. We have our ideas and we debate them, and there are people who disagree with us, and then the audience is going to notice what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and hopefully they can't take the best ideas. That's true. I think these days, especially when going on about fake news, tend to underestimate how critical people can actually be. But this dealing with ideas is really important for setting the worldview of what is
Mm.
the world like, what are the problems one can debate. And of course, there are many sub debates. So society has become much vaster than I could ever have imagined in the 40s. In many ways, there are sub debates going on that can be super important for some groups and then change things without other groups ever hearing about them.
Well, this is something that I think we touched on Twitter the other day about the kind of emergence of all of these cultural substreams that often go completely unnoticed by the mainstream, but nevertheless have important impacts on the currents of the mainstream.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, which I think you were initially making, and I kind of got involved with, but that there are
That's true.
a large number of ongoing discussions that we can use to impact the broader sort of social milieu, um, and by doing so, we can spread important ideas. So yeah, I think Hayek was onto something, and evidently was reasonably successful in his goals. Um, but yeah, so sort of going back a little bit to the the kind of core topic. Um, so I particularly liked um, the life extension argument because indeed it's plausible with these technologies that we can get someone living longer and then they will personally discount the future less hopefully because they have a greater chance of being in it. Um, so far, I've got. Uh,
By the
oh,
way, it's worth noticing that you don't even need to assume Aubrey de Grey shows up with the immortality pill for this argument to work. You actually get it even with a normal the current lifespan. So the life expectancy today is about 80 years. So assuming the person you're debating is not really, really old and on his or her last legs, actually there is quite a lot of decades to the future. And that, of course, means that a lot of risk piles up. even if it's kind of one chance in a thousand per year of a nuclear war. Okay, for 10 years, now we're on one in 100. And if you live several decades, oh, suddenly a few percent. At this point, it's a risk that when you look at the mortality table, it's bigger than quite a lot of cancers and
Mm.
other horrible diseases you have heard about. Um, uh, and suddenly becomes rather personal. And this is even without any radical life extension or anything cool like that.
That's that's a very good point. I think anybody who's played enough RPGs knows that if you're, needing to roll anything but a 99 or a 100 to win the check, and there's a pretty good chance you'll roll a 99 or a 100. Um,
Yeah, and the dice god has a terrible sense of humor, and the patterns you tend to see in the randomness are deeply annoying. And this is, of course, something that happens all the time. Actually, most of us experience a one in a million chance once a month or something like
mm,
that. It's called Littlewood's law of large numbers, although it was probably Freeman Dyson who came up with it.
pretty good
But he
chance.
already attributed to Littlewood. So and that,
Yeah,
of course, also means bad luck sometimes happen too.
yeah, absolutely, and it's something that seems obvious. This is kind of a general point, but it's quite common to encounter some kind of coincidence where you go, "Wow, what are the odds of that? That seems so remote." And maybe you try to do a little back of the envelope calculation and go, "Wow, my chances of being here with this person, meeting them at this time, just it's so remote." But there are so many opportunities for these kind of coincidences every day. Every time you pass a person, every time you visit a website or read a article or share something online or whatever, you've got an opportunity for one of these kind of coincidences. So it's not surprising that they pop up every so often.
And
Um,
of course, they also add to risks. So, one of my favorite stories is the Cuban Missile Crisis, the number of close calls during that period. That the, the situation was super tense. And then, of course, any little event could trigger an all out nuclear war. And there was no shortage of events. My favorite one was that an animal, a bear, was climbing a fence near a military base close to Winnipeg. And the fence, this being a military base, had a proximity alarm that went off, but they had misconnected it. So it became this, it activated a scramble for the local airfield. And of course, everybody knew what was going on around Cuba at this time. So when there was a scramble alarm, everybody ran to
mm,
the nuclear bombers because they knew what was up. And then one guy, a real hero who I really wish I could figure out the name of, managed to realize what was wrong, drove out a jeep kind of on the starting strip, kind of stop, stop, stop. It was a false alarm. That's just one of them. In this case, that animal could have literally triggered World War III. And
mm,
these things, of course, pile up in tense situations. So that gets to another form of a risk that I think is important, those darn combination risks, where you have a systemic failure of something that triggers other things. In many cases, I think the most likely thing to wipe us out is not going to be a nice, clear cut single risk, but one thing triggers another thing that triggers all things at the same time. And then we end up buried under both a bit of biowarfare and the nuclear and, weapons and some other stupid things. And then climate change comes in too. The problem is stuff gets interconnected in a globalized world, and that makes it also more fragile. The problem is, of course, reasoning about these kind of messy risks is no fun. Karen Kuhlman has this nice paper about unsexy existential risks, where she points out that we academically love sexy risks,
mm.
where the kind of asteroids, it's clean cut and neat, and we understand the physics, or nuclear war or AI, kind of technology is the cause, or you could fix things using technology. It becomes very convenient. Some big mess where you have a lot of things interacting that doesn't fit with academic boundaries. Oh dear,
Something
who
like
wants to work on that? Let's go back to asteroids.
the Bronze Age collapse, where there's a whole bunch of factors, probably some disease, probably some war, maybe some famine, all combining to create a collapse of civilization that we still don't fully understand.
Yeah,
Um,
So I think that is an interesting category, and again, just like AI, you might not want to bring it up
Hmm.
too much because again, it's complicated and messy, and it's almost like a flypaper for the conversation.
So that's something that in this is kind of why I've split it into two arguments to some degree. Is that the first argument I want to be, you know, clear cut. Climate change isn't the biggest existential risk. Here's my specific claim, and here's why. All I need to do to prove that is demonstrate that any one risk, in this case engineered pandemics, is greater than climate change and nuclear war. Um, but then I want to move on to the second argument, and I think in there I'm going to get a little bit more, a little bit more in the weeds. So my uh, I've got three premises. People in the future matter greatly. There are major risks that threaten future people, which are currently receiving relatively little attention. We have plausible ways of affecting known risks and discovering as yet unknown ones. And the conclusion, we should push for policies that radically efforts.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Then, of course, the tricky thing here is if you're a rational egoist, you might then say, yeah, why should I care about those future people? What have they done for me lately?
Exactly. And this is, I think it's going to be the kind of the crux of the argument because premise two is pretty much entirely demonstrated in the first argument. Oops, I'll mention a bit of the complexities and specifically the kind of neglectedness, um, but it's pretty much dealt with. Premise three is easy to argue. Just I need to list off policies that we can use to affect X risk. So yeah, it's that first one that and I don't know into his mind. Maybe he'll be very convinced by it and have some egoistic reason for valuing future people, which would make it all easier. But
Uh, yeah, so I think that is actually an interesting thing. So Samuel Scheffer has an interesting little book, Why Worry About Future Generations? So most of the discussions we do around our institute tend to be very, very consequentialist and utilitarian in outlook. And it's so refreshing to read Scheffler because he's actually coming from a kind of deontological perspective. He actually gives some arguments where he thinks that it might be selfishly good to have a future.
excuse me, a bit of hay fever just caused me to sneeze.
Ah, yes. Yeah, there is a lot of lovely biology out there.
Yeah, all those gametes flying through the air.
Yeah.
um, that
So,
sounds very interesting.
yeah. So Scheffler has, let's see, reasons of interest that the value of many of our activity depends on the survival of humanity long after we ourselves are gone. So, somebody building a cathedral, for example, wants that cathedral to stand as a monument to God's glory, or maybe just that they were cool architects. So a lot of what we do is kind of based on this assumption that there are future generations. Now, that in itself might be done very altruistically, but it might also be just that we want to be part of something larger than ourselves. Even from an egoistic perspective, I think one can totally want to do that. It's also kind of an interesting thing that because Scheffler doesn't want to argue that this is just good for us, but for your discussion, it might actually be exactly what you want to argue. So
That's
Scheffler wanted to say something like, "Okay, it's good for us because it's good for future generations, and we care about them." Um, but you could say also that no, I just want future generations to be impressed by this, um, and then leave it at that. That's actually a simpler ethical stance.
I found an interesting idea while looking into this that I haven't really considered much before, but does seem potentially compelling, is that we have some obligations to past generations. For example, an obligation to continue some of their works if we deem their works to be good, that we should continue watering the trees that they've planted, that kind of thing, metaphorically. Um, Also, perhaps that we have some duty to venerate them when they did good things, or something along those lines. I'm not as convinced about that, um, but yeah, I think it was in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I was looking into just general arguments around kind of value of future people, um, which would suggest I think there's a stronger case for our having obligations to future people than past people, because we have a causal link that we can influence to future people. Um,
Yeah, of course, the Russian cosmists had an interesting take on this. They felt like we have an obligation to past people to resurrect them.
I like that.
Mm. Uh, so there is quite a lot of interesting things that tie us to past and future generations. Sometimes it might just be that we want some kind of reflectivity. It's a little bit like thinking about biometrics and surveillance data. The future is going to know so much about us, including things we don't even know they can know, because they can infer it using their super deep neural networks and AI and whatnot. Just like we can figure out things about the past that past people couldn't imagine was possible to figure out, like DNA tests.
Mm.
So you could argue that we should have a kind of temporal golden rule. We should be treating actually information from the past with a certain degree of respect, because we hope to be respected by the future. And the idea is
Okay.
that if this becomes the norm, then we have a better chance of actually not having future generations dig through our stuff and kind of make bad memes about our shortcomings or whatever we're worried about.
I mean, I kind of want to be a bad meme in 1,000 years' time. That sounds quite good.
It is kind of a form of immortality. After all, Herostratus is still vividly remembered for wanting to have become famous. That's the only thing we remember of him.
Oh, that's excellent. He just wanted more clout.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and in many ways it totally succeeded because it was the first example ever of a Streisand effect. So for those who don't know, he burned down, I think it was a temple of Zeus in some town, and when asked afterward, "What did you do?" "I want to be famous," and the court decided, "Okay, we're gonna strike his name from every inscription. He must not be mentioned." But obviously, they totally failed. It's the Streisand effect echoing through the millennia.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Um, so yeah, I guess something I also want to dive into is well, Derek Parfit has, I think it's widely agreed in philosophy, some of the most important work in kind of population ethics and our ethical duties and responsibilities to far future people. And he put forward lots of this in his landmark or
Groundbreaking.
groundbreaking, one of the two, um, a little portmanteau there, book Reasons and Persons, which I own but have not yet read. I've tried to get into it, and
Tip: skip the reasons part. I found it also terribly, terribly hard to get into unless you're a real FSC. Go to the persons part, because then he immediately start talking about teletransporters, teleporting you to Mars, and a lot of stuff he just borrows straight from Star Trek. And it's very readable, it's very fun, and suddenly you immediately get into it.
okay,
But
cool.
his hitchhiker in the desert, kind of reasoning about whether he should be helped or not helped and doing game theory, that's super boring. There are cool stuff there too, but you should start with the person part.
Okay, that's an excellent tip because I've been, doing my best to get into the reasons, but I'm not an ethicist. Maybe one day, maybe I'll manage to get all the implicit knowledge that I need, but right now, no, I can't get through dense philosophical works like that. Um, though I have got Bertrand Russell's On Philosophical Problems, or what is it? On Problems of Philosophy, I think.
Mm.
that I need to get into because apparently that's an excellent read for the kind of aspiring, um, well, more epistemology than ethics, but you know,
Yeah,
similar.
Russell was very good at writing, and I wouldn't say Parfit was bad at writing. I think he writes quite well for a philosopher,
Mm.
but Russell was good at writing.
Which does make a lot of difference. Sometimes it's more engaging to read a well-written book on a subject you don't really care about than a uh, clunkily written one on a subject that fascinates you.
Yeah, but getting back to Parfit, Parfit's argument is kind of classic, of course, where he brings up three possible worlds: one where everything just goes on as normal, one with a nuclear war killing 99% of humanity, and one with a nuclear war killing everybody. And the question is, what's the difference in badness between these worlds? And he, of course, argues that. The difference between the second and third is much greater than between the first and second, even though the number of people killed is not that much greater in the third example. And it seems like most people are kind of mildly confused when they experience that kind of question. So you can kind of ask people around and find that many people don't really think there is much difference, except when you frame things in a long-term perspective.
Mm.
If you start talking, for example, that in the long run there might be a utopian society, suddenly people shift their views, which probably shows that they don't think very carefully about it. But if you do think careful about it, and I do think philosophers who think about it actually do, then you end up probably with Sidgwick saying that this would be the greatest of all conceivable crimes to destroy humanity. And it's not just utilitarians caring about the value of all the future generation. You can also have perfectionists. Parfit points out that there are various schools of philosophy saying, no, no, we should be aiming at becoming more just or better in some way, and that also gets disrupted. Now, if you're an egoist and don't care about that, then you might still argue that, yeah, but maybe there is some you might be existing during this period, and it's probably not very fun to get nuked. But generally, of course, people care about other people even when they regard themselves as egoist. In fact, from a rational egoist standpoint, the welfare of your friends matters quite a bit. And I think it was C.S. Lewis who pointed out that, well, he has a really hard time imagining the welfare of future generations. Even though he was writing science fiction and talking to science fiction authors, and actually read Olaf Stapledon and liked that, but he cares about his kids,
Mm.
and he cares about them caring about their kids, and so on. So you have this telescoping effect that even if I personally don't care about my great 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 grandkids, I do care about my kids caring about their kids and so on. And that means that I need to care at least to some extent about these far removed generations.
This is something I was thinking about bringing up because Destiny is a father, and I I would strongly suspect he wants his kids or adult offspring to go on living once he dies. So he's currently about 30, I think. He's around about my age. Um, so, maybe he's got another 50, 60, 70 years left, depending on kind of how technology goes. Maybe another 1,000, but, assuming it doesn't go radically, another 50 years or so left. But then his kid will probably have another 30 or so years on top of that. And then, another 30 maybe for his kid and so on and so forth.
It
Um,
adds up.
yeah. And when you start figuring in, you might not personally be super close to your kids' friends, but you probably get on reasonably well with them and want them to have a pleasant life. And even though you don't know their future partner or partners yet, you want them to have a generally good life. And it starts expanding out, and you get to and you want them to have a livable world because you don't want them to just be raised in a bunker eating nutrient gruel and so forth. So you end up with quite a large tree of people whom you, even if you can't identify specifically the individual, is something that Parfit I know touches on. Even you can't identify the specific individual who's going to benefit, you probably still want, in some sense, for them to have a good life. Um,
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And generally, of course, we are social beings. We're interconnected with other people. We care about contemporary people. We care about people in the past, and so on. And that web, I think, is already enough to give us a certain interest in that the future goes well. It might not necessarily be enough to say that, yeah, I care about people in a billion years, but it certainly means that, oh yeah, I don't want our civilization to crash over the next century. And of course, quite a lot of things we care about are not just people, but buildings and institutions. uh, a shockingly number of people felt really sad and depressed when Notre Dame had
mm,
the fire. And I remember 9/11, seeing it on TV. And what really got my heart to ache was, oh, the building is falling down. That's
mm,
kind of, I realized at that moment, wait a minute, there's a lot of people being harmed here, but I'm responding even more to the building, which shows a lot of awareness of human psyche. But there are many things in the world that we dearly care about, whether
mm.
that is giant pandas or our favorite university, or just the music of Mozart. And
Yeah,
of
that's
course,
an
the
excellent point.
music of Mozart doesn't make any sense without any human to hear it.
Just making some notes.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point that you raise very well. Unsurprising as you're a philosopher, but
Well, I just picked it up on the job.
Anders, for those who don't know, is a natural philosopher, which I've started using that as your description now because I think that's the best way of summing up what you
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I only have the high school training in philosophy. So I think my high school philosophy teacher would be pretty impressed by me ending up actually in the faculty of philosophy. But then I learned how to write philosophy paper just by co-authoring them with real philosophers and seeing what they do, and sometimes asking them, why did you argue it like that? And sometimes they even have good reasons.
um, yeah, so I'm trying to do somewhat of the same thing. We've co-authored a paper or two together, and hopefully more in the future. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so I think I observed a similar thing during the Syrian civil war. There were a lot of people very concerned about the loss of our kind of global heritage with various historical sites, which I think it's difficult to put monetary value on these things. You know, how do we trade off between the existence of the Parthenon or the Great Pyramids versus ex-human lives? But it's pretty clear that a lot of people strongly value these things. Um,
And
and
it's even easier to value the world heritage than people.
mm,
People can be so annoying. It's not a coincidence that the UK first developed the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals. And it took a few decades before there was a Society for Prevention of Cruelty Against Kids. Because kids, oh, they're so annoying. But a dog or a cat, poor little innocent thing. And again, we can argue that that shows that maybe there is something wrong with us, but it is a very strong force. And I do think that it's pretty clear that the best way of preserving world heritage is to have humans around preserving it.
yeah,
Just leaving it to nature is not going to turn out well.
no, I mean it'll produce some cool post-apocalyptic shots for the film trailers and whatnot, but that's about it. And if there's no
But
humans
you
around
want
to watch the
somebody to
films,
maintain it as nice ruins. You just don't want it to fall into ruin just naturally.
this is true. Gonna have
Uh,
curated
I'm
climbing
arguing in
events.
a paper also that, of course, we want to keep humans around to maintain nature.
Mm,
Although they're messing up the biosphere quite big time right now. Long run, we are the best last hope for the biosphere to actually survive long term, because we can actually do things like put up a solar shield when the sun gets brighter. Or we can build robots to put up a solar shield if no humans are around. It actually turns out that humans are kind of handy for a lot of things. So depending on what you value in the world, typically you will find that having humans around to do that helps.
Yeah, that's a very worthwhile point. Um, I think there's also argument, so kind of extending the kind of tree of people we want to have a good life, one's son, one's son's offspring, etc. Um, I think there's also a strong argument to be made there. This is something that Toby Ord has taken to arguing a lot recently, and I think it's a very compelling kind of positive slant on the existential risk issue. Is that it's not just that we're talking about billions, trillions, quintillions of, or quadrillions in between that, of human lives, but we're talking about that many human lives that could be far, far better than current human lives in states of hedonic and eudaimonic pleasure and satisfaction that completely blow away anything that we currently experience, or at least extend and intensify the periods of great happiness that we do feel. Um, and even if one doesn't accept that all those X millions, whatever, of gajillions of future people are going to experience that, or that they're experiencing it has great value, I think there's still quite a strong argument along those lines to be made with people that one knows, and the personal kind of friends and relationships and so forth. Um, because we generally want our friends to be happy and have good lives, and if there's a chance that even if it's one's son or grandson or whatever is going to experience a radically better life than they could today, which is plausible with the way that biological engineering is developing. Um, I'm hopefully speaking in a few weeks to Brian Earp,
Ah,
who
oh yeah, we've
uh,
written papers together.
yeah, some rather interesting ones, and I'm specifically talking to him about his Love Drugs book alongside Professor Julian Savulescu, um, who is, and they're talking about the possibility of using pharmacological interventions, drugs, to enhance and modulate humans' ability to feel affection and love and these kind of hedonic states. So I've still got to get through the book. I've got it on audiobook and I'm grabbing it on Kindle too. Um, and yeah, once I've gotten through that, I'm going to have him on and chat about it. And I think he provides plenty of examples though for ways that we can, in the fairly short term, potentially engineer our hedonic and emotional states.
Yeah. And generally, I think one can pile up a lot of reasons to think that the future could be much better. Of course, the pessimist will say, yeah, but it could get much worse too. The interesting thing is, it's not a coincidence that a lot of thinking about existential risk comes from a transhumanist community. Because if you're a transhumanist, you think the future could be radically different. And then if you're smart, you realize, oh, it could be radically bad.
That
So it's actually
distribution does
fairly
go
natural.
both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. If the future is heavy-tailed. Now, if you have a very normal and modest view, then you would say, yeah, the future could be worse. And that means higher taxes and a bit more pollution. Or it could be better, lower taxes and a little bit less pollution. That's not a very big range.
Mm,
And you might actually not be too concerned about existential risk or anything like that. But if you realize that, oh, the future could become radically different, then you have a good reason to try to fix things. But you also have something to look forward to if you do things right. And there is suddenly stakes to the game. You
mm,
might lose out something good. And I think this also goes if you're relatively here and now. You probably want to live in a society that actually looks forward to a future rather than dreading it. If you think that the future is a dog eat dog world of dwindling resources and so on, in that case, you're not going to be willing to fix things because you want to save up for you and your dear ones. It becomes rather nasty. Rather, having an optimistic outlook actually means that there's a better chance of getting a win win situation. And I do think this is important when thinking about existential risk. One of the big problems with much of the traditional environmental thinking about climate change is that it's based on, oh, we need to stop economic growth.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a bit like the abstinence education in America to reduce sexually transmitted disease. It doesn't work and it doesn't appeal to people.
Mm.
On the other hand, you can fix it in other ways, which might not make the local preacher very happy, but might actually both keep people healthy and happy. And the same thing is true for the environment. James Martin had this concept of eco-affluence. If we can make the luxurious choice the green one,
Mm.
so it's not just ethical and green, but it's also better than the current, then people will want that. This is, of course, why I think the Impossible Burger is such a good thing, because it's actually quite delicious. It's not like, oh, I have to force myself to eat it because it's the moral or green choice.
Mm.
No, no, no. This is something I would order on the menu just because it's tasty.
And it's a bit
And
exotic and novel and has the kind of Silicon Valley sheen to it.
yeah, not quite as much of a sheen as the Soylent stuff, but this is the level I'm aiming at. And of course, I can hardly wait until I get really weird gourmet and molecular gourmet food done by in vitro meat production.
Mm.
I mean, we can do so much cool stuff by interleaving muscle fibers and the vegetables and doing concoctions that couldn't exist
Get
normally.
mixed zebra lion meat in one one steak. That'd
Exactly.
probably be horrible. Lions would be really stringy.
Yeah, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. But this is where we actually want to bring in the proper gourmet chefs and
Mm.
who can come up with some very interesting things.
If,
So getting back to the
oh yeah.
climate change part, you want to ensure that we look forward to fixing it. This is where Elon Musk has been super successful. He realized, okay, I need to get rid of fossil fuels. How do I do that? I need to develop a lot of better solar power. I need people to use a lot of solar power. I need electric cars. How do I get people to use electric cars? You could make a super expensive little car for the really environmentally conscious.
Or
That's
make
not
a
going to work.
sporty roadster.
Yep. So that's what he did. And
Mm.
let's face it, it worked.
Yeah, not least because now the major car companies are kind of playing catch up
Yeah.
with their own electric vehicles. Um,
And it's a bit of a status symbol.
mm.
And Teslas are nice cars, and now, of course, the competitor will also make nice but non-polluting cars.
They've got to make the BMW fancy series equivalent rather than the little tiny commuter crap box. We do just have a message from chat saying being transhumanist is about wishful thinking, which I think that there is part of that is reasonable criticism. A lot of the transhumanism of the kind of late 90s, early 2000s was very much focused around look at all the cool stuff we might be able to do in the future. But I think this kind of conversation, what you were saying just earlier, Anders, about the fact that a lot of the research into, at least the focused research into existential risk, is coming from the transhumanist community or people adjacent to it, in part because I think a lot of us realise that there was a fair bit of wishful thinking going on, and we should also identify not just the cool stuff that might happen, which is important to think about and is a great goal to shoot for, but also identify the potential bad sides of all this powerful technology.
Also, it's worth noticing that Christianity is wishful thinking, socialism is wishful thinking. Practically all big systems of thought are various forms of wishful thinking. People say, oh, the world has some very crappy features. What if there was a way around them, or actually they're not even there? And then, of course, one can argue that some of these wishes are more helpful than others. So I do think there is something interesting about where do you take your wishes,
Mm.
because just I agree, sitting around just wishing that things were different, that's not going to help very much. On the other hand, going into the lab trying to make it real, well, we have ended up actually getting the Star Trek tricorders and systems because, yeah, all the techies grew up watching Star Trek and they wished for that. So I do think there is something very interesting going on here.
Mm.
The really interesting thing is, of course, yeah, you should be a bit careful what you wish for. we have gotten a fair bit of technologies that we wished for in the 90s, and not all of them are that great when we encounter them up close.
Yeah, the cypherpunks had a lot of good ideas, had a lot of very cool ideas. Bitcoin,
Well, I remember being on the anarcho the cipher list in the 90s, where people were talking, oh yes, if we could just make a digital currency, we could totally destroy the state because everybody can move their money online and it can never be traced. And then somebody else said, oh yeah, and you could have assassination markets that would force
I
politicians to be
remember
nice,
assassination markets.
untraceable markets where you could use this digital money. So if enough people pull together money against some disliked politician, they're gonna get killed, and this is going to make politics really lovely and good. It's kind of a good thing we didn't succeed on that,
Yeah,
and it's even an interesting question about how did we dodge the bullet on it, and that's definitely not relevant here. But
mm,
many of these ideas are, of course, super naive, but most ideas are super naive before you actually try to do them. In most of science and philosophy, the first try is just plain stupid. Then you learn why it was stupid, and then you can make the less stupid version. Before you know it, you might actually get somewhere. So getting back to existential risk here,
mm,
uh, it's an interesting question where you can actually do the most practical stuff, and I guess that's the part three of your argument, um, where one
mm.
would like to put in one's effort. And maybe one is Elon Musk. In that case, it's going to be very different from if one is kind of a penny pinching academic. Then you might want to spend your efforts on something else. But I do think it is also an important thing. Existential risk is actually quite dependent on human action.
Mm.
In the 1800s, when people were talking about the end of the world, it was kind of a matter of nature. Sooner or later, a giant comet is going to hit Earth and shatter the planet, and there is nothing anybody can do about it. And then in 1945, we had this awkward realization, oh, we did that mushroom cloud.
Yeah.
We are kind of responsible for our own demise. Oh, that means we also can avoid doing it.
Well, particularly the realization towards the end of the initial Manhattan Project period, when several of the scientists were getting concerned about the possibility of literally setting the atmosphere alight. I think Fermi estimated it and came up with what was it, like less than 20%, but it was still a fairly large
So,
possibility.
so the, the actual thing was they were fairly convinced that it couldn't happen.
Mm,
But Fermi liked to kind of eerily remind people that, yeah, this is just based on our testing. And there were several people apparently at the Trinity's test site who were really nervous, above and beyond the fact that they're testing a nuclear weapon. I think they needed a lot of blood pressure lowering the medications there. Uh, but it's an interesting report they wrote up after that. Accidentally, we got two teams working on the question, can you ignite a fusion reaction in the atmosphere? And they worked separately. Not because of any clever plan, just because they happen to be at two different sites. And they analyzed it separately, which is a really good way of getting a more
mm.
robust conclusion, and found a fairly good argument why, nope, it's not going to happen.
You've
But
spoken about this previously with regards to the Large Hadron Collider. Um, would would you mind telling us a bit about that?
yeah, so that was a few years back when people were concerned about that we might accidentally make black holes or vacuum decay or strangelets or a long list of other weird things that physicists have actually suggested somewhere in the literature. Because physicists are always suggesting weird particles, and some of them have very dangerous properties. So some people were concerned that what about this accelerator destroying the world? And the physicists were going, no, 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 it's totally safe. And then people were kind of keeping on yelling and indeed pointing out that, wait a minute, you built this to test physics. How can you be so certain that it's totally safe? Eventually, we actually got around to write a bunch of papers showing the outline of why it was safe. And I think many of them have good arguments. One of the standard ones is we have been hit by cosmic rays that are more intense than anything you can make in the Hadron Collider, and it's been going on for billions of years. We're still here. It turns out that this argument has a flaw that needs to be patched. And then that argument has another flaw that needs to be patched, but you can kind of do it. But after patching an argument 5 or 6 times, you start to get a bit nervous about it. So I wrote a paper that didn't exactly endear me to the physicists, where I was pointing out that if you make an argument proving that the risk is zero, that doesn't mean the risk is zero. It just means that the risk is zero if your argument is right, and might be 99% certain that your argument is right because you're a smart fellow. But of course, there is 1% chance that your argument doesn't work, and we actually haven't gotten a bound on the risk. The solution here is, of course, to have several independent arguments. And this is a little bit like Swiss cheese security in computer security. Uh, your security measure is going to be like a sheet of Swiss cheese. There's going to be a hole in it, and various hackers and other errors are going to penetrate through it. But if you have several independent layers of security, the probability that something gets through all of them can get arbitrarily small. And the same thing is true if you have several independent arguments about why you can't make a black hole in the Large Hadron Collider, or if it happens, it's actually going to evaporate. So this is a good way of making robust arguments. It's not neat. The academic papers you want to publish typically want to have a beautiful, simple argument, and then you're just done and walk away from the explosion. But in this case, you have a whole bunch of arguments that just show that, yep, it cannot happen because of this, and this. And even if 2/3 of them or nearly all of them are wrong, yeah, there's still one or two arguments that are going to catch the risk. So this is annoying in many ways, especially when you want to publish this. I'm working on a paper just like this about an even more obscure particle accelerator risk. But at the same time, it's a good way of actually making good risk estimates. If you actually have the fate of the world weighing on making the right decision about your nuclear weapon, you better try to have independent teams checking it.
Mm. Got another comment from chat that actually brings up a kind of tangential issue that's relevant. So, making nanobots deconstructing the world is ranked number one on destroying the world on what's going to destroy it. What would your take be on that?
Uh, Using nanobots to destroy the world is kind of a cumbersome way of doing it. So I think in principle one could do that, but by that point, of course, you have very advanced nanotechnology, which you can use to destroy the world in other ways. Uh, so the story about nanobots destroying the world is actually quite interesting because Eric Drexler, in his fantastic Engines of Creation from 1986, he's talking about the possibility of nanotechnology, essentially outlining what can be done. And over there, he's also noticing that, yeah, maybe a self-replicating machine could go out of control. And in the next paragraph, he explains why he thinks this is an unlikely problem and there are easy ways of handling it. Unfortunately, nobody quotes the second paragraph. Everybody just quotes the first one, where he mentions something like gray goo, and that's kind of a suitably cool and horrifying idea. So people ran off in the 90s with it, and of course meant that a lot of people gave poor Eric a lot of flack for coming up with that concept.
Eric's currently a fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute where Anders works.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Now,
Anders is also a fellow,
yep.
senior research fellow.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
I've been there for a long time. I'm kind of getting dust and cobwebs. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, why did Eric even bring up self-replicating nanomachines? Well, he believed that's the best way of making a lot of stuff using nanomachines. And then he started doing a bit more thinking and realized actually it's stupid. When you want to make something, normally you have a factory. You want to actually have a nanofactory putting pieces together into larger pieces that get put together into larger and larger and larger pieces. That's efficient. You don't really try to culture and grow everything in a field. So in his book Nanosystems, which was 91 or something like that, he already kind of demonstrated that, okay, this is way more effective. Self-replicating nanomachines, well, we got bacteria, we could probably build things like that, but it's tricky and it's not that terribly useful. So by the time we can make nanomachines that can gobble up random matter around them and make more nanomachines, we already have really powerful nanomanufacturing. And that can, of course, be used to make horrible stuff anyway. So the self-replicating nanomachines, they're kind of a very late problem. It's a bit like saying, yeah, super AI can be used to kind of hack the laws of physics and destroy the world. Maybe, but by the point you have destructive super AI smart enough to do that, you have long ago had smarter enough AI to mess up the world if you have bad intentions. So again, you have this timeline. The later capability might be devastating, but there are sufficiently worrisome things early on. Now, nanotechnology is probably one of the more benign technologies here because we can kind of see where we're coming with that. People have been a bit worried about nanoparticles, for example, because we already know that really small particles can give us health problems. We had that problem with asbestos, so people got very worked up about the safety of nanoparticles, which is kind of a good thing because we actually learn a lot about how to make them safe and even use them instead of antibiotics and a lot of other really good. So what I'm worried about is rather that okay, you can 3D print 3D printers 3D printing cruise missiles. That's going to be a much bigger problem than the nanomachines gobbling stuff up.
Yeah, and a hypersonic cruise missile, the main difficulty is like designing the shape. Once you know the shape,
Don't worry, you can download the design from Pirate Bay any decade now. That's actually an interesting thing because, yeah, sharing dangerous information online. After all, 3D prints for guns have already been an
yeah.
issue. I wonder when we get the first 3D printed missile shared online.
Mm.
That's going to really make the gun conversation in the US go really ballistic.
Oh dear.
Sorry, couldn't resist that pun.
Um, so yeah, and yeah, it's absolutely concerning because you've got very simple arrangements of matter that can do a tremendous amount of damage. Just like ignoring explosives, assuming that 3D printers have a control preventing you from, making C4 or similar explosive compounds. Even then, you've got the potential for creating a say scramjet based missile, as long as you can get enough reactive material to provide that initial kick, then you can run it off like methane or hydrogen, which is trivially easy to acquire, via any kind of perfectly legitimate mechanisms. At which point you've got a hypersonic kill vehicle that, with a little processor package and GPS, you can target
Yeah.
anywhere in the world.
The interesting part here is, of course, right now this sounds awesomely futuristic because let's face it, making hypersonic missiles work is not exactly easy.
Mm,
It is actual rocket science. But uh, the thing is, of course, once somebody has done it, in principle, you can put up the blueprint and replicate it. It's a little bit like rootkits in hacking.
mm,
Actually figuring out how to penetrate computer system requires a fair bit of deep computer knowledge, but you can also code it up as a script and then hand it out to all sorts of people online, and they don't know what they're doing, but they can just run the script. So that replication of an advanced threat is an entirely new thing. And of course, this is getting a lot of intelligence services rather worried because they realize that, yeah, the half-life of secret is going down quite a bit. Now, as one CIA guy said, yeah, in the future, I actually expect all our secrets to be on the Pirate Bay. He literally said this. But I also hope that our adversaries' secrets are on the next line of the Pirate Bay, so we can all download the torrents of everybody's deepest, darkest secrets,
This is
which
something I
might still
wonder.
not be very good for the stability of the world.
It's something I wonder about a fair bit, whether a radical increase in transparency would be a net positive because we've got less like communication and coordination problems. A lot of the biggest near misses of the Cold War, we're talking about some of the issues in the Cuban Missile Crisis earlier, but almost all of the uh, major close calls were as a result of some kind of communication and coordination failure, which, if everyone knew exactly where each other's satellites were all the time and exactly what each space launch is versus each missile test versus each like flight of balloons coming over the horizon or whatever, then it's going to be much easier to predict everyone else's actions and avoid the kind of confusion that can lead to grave miscalculation.
Yeah,
However,
yeah. However,
Yeah, well, you go ahead.
I think one interesting issue is interpretation of actions. So you might be doing certain things, and yeah, it looks very benign, but I might still interpret it in a weird manner. So the Cuban Missile Crisis started when America put mid-distance missiles in Turkey, and then Khrushchev decided, okay, I'm going to do tit for tat. I'm going to put some on Cuba.
Mhm.
And America got totally crazy. And by all accounts, Khrushchev and the others around him were really confused and surprised because it was a symmetric situation. What was there to get upset about? But they actually didn't understand Americans well enough to realize that that was apparently a step too far. The problem here is, of course, both of them, in some sense, knew the state of the missiles and the location, but they didn't understand each other's mind state. So if we want to look at each other's secrets, we might need to really understand each other's inner state, and that might be really tricky. Anybody who's been trying to interpret, let's say, a quarrel with where you see the CCTV camera and the footage afterwards, actually figuring out who started it and who did what is surprisingly tough. So even a really transparent world might actually be quite tricky to figure out. Still, there's quite a lot of these things where people just are unnecessarily confusing each other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, I don't know the outcomes. I think it'd be very difficult to predict. Oh, sorry, just a sec.
It's also worth noting that David Brin in his excellent The Transparent Society, where he's kind of arguing for a world of total surveillance where everybody can surveil everybody. He points out that this might not necessarily be nicest, but he thinks it's stable.
Mm,
But it also requires accountability. If you notice that your government is doing something bad, then you can hold them accountable by showing footage. The most disturbing
yes.
thing about the Snowden scandal was not so much that the NSA was eavesdropping on everybody, but the fact that after this was revealed and the lack of controls was demonstrated, they still get to do it. But nobody actually figure out a better way of keeping the intelligence services working on what they should be working on, etc. That was the really disturbing finding, and that's kind of worrisome.
Right. Did Bryn coin the term surveillance, or
I think he
is it?
might have coined that
Yeah.
term. Yeah. So his argument in the book is basic that surveillance technology is getting more and more powerful, cheaper and cheaper. You're not going to be able to avoid living in a future where it's a lot of surveillance. The only question is it going to be kind of one-way mirror, so you have various agencies that can watch everybody else, but we can't watch them? Or is it going to be two-way transparency, which might still be awkward, but that way we can actually keep tabs on our government?
Mm,
And I think he's right. It's just that things are messier than that because it's hard to interpret actions. There is a lot of misinformation. We can't actually pay attention to everything going on all the time, and some forms of privacy are kind of valuable to us. And there are also ways of hiding things in ways that actually are somewhat workable, even in a high surveillance world. So it's much messier than that book, but it's still an
mm.
excellent book. Also, one of the best defenses of open society I ever read.
That sounds very good. I shall add that to my ever-growing list.
Yeah, so it's worth reading it also because David Brin, being a science fiction author, is also a very good writer.
Mm. Yeah, I'm increasingly of the opinion that there needs to be much more overlap between the kind of the worlds of STEM and humanities. I think this is something that the FHI, Future of Humanity Institute, does very well. Is that you get well, I mean, your background is in computational neuroscience. You're very much on the hard end of neuroscience, which is a moderately hard science. I say as a fellow neuroscientist. Um, but you and pretty much everyone there seriously engages with a lot of the ideas of science fiction. You get philosophers and legal experts and policy experts and so forth in to collaborate. And I think for a lot of the going back to what you were saying about the kind of combinatorial risks, the facts that is if anything does do us in, it's probably not just going to be a nuclear war, but a nuclear war followed by a like massive pandemic caused by the collapse of the healthcare structures, which leads to a full civilizational collapse, meaning that we can't avert an asteroid strike or some kind of chain of events like this. Um, and to start really engaging with those kind of problems, we need more people who are capable um, of stepping outside of their limited technical field with appropriate humility and an ability to interact with people working in other specialist fields. And I don't know exactly how to achieve that, but I think the FHI's model is a really good start.
Yeah, I think one useful approach, this is something everybody can do, is to try to culture and nurture curiosity.
Mm.
Just being curious, how do they do it in that other field? One of my ongoing fascinations have been engineering. It's so different from what I do. I'm a scientist. I'm interested in figuring out how natural things work, not make them necessarily. And engineers, of course, they want to make something that actually work. And there are disciplines, there are the methods, there are the tools to do that, which are not really known in science. Certainly, many scientists might know a few pieces of useful engineer for making their own instrument or repairing them when they break, etc. But it's a very, very different mindset. And then there is this realization, whoa, historians, they think so in such an alien way. It's so fascinating to deal with historians. And this goes for practically every field. Archival science, which is a field I'm kind of afraid of even getting into. Oh, wow, they know stuff which is so utterly different. Now, that curiosity, you can nurture that, and that makes that you get more chances to actually figure out when you get to an important thing. Oh, there are solutions over in that field that nobody on my side has heard about. And I think we should do that across academia, across society. We should know a little bit more about the others, the guys.
That's a really interesting point, and I think part of the utility there is the fact that fields approach even just scientific discovery, ignoring philosophy and English and literature and so forth. Even within science, while Popper has a very nice, rigidly laid out structure for how true science works, in actuality, the methods of discovery that scientists use vary massively by field. Both the kind of philosophical techniques employed, the way that they approach confidence and generating proof versus evidence versus getting hypotheses and inklings and hunches are all very different. And while they are adapted for their field, there's a lot to be had potentially with applying them across fields and finding out, how do we um, explore the the history of wireheading from the perspective of a historian, of a neuroscientist, of a computer scientist, of a philosopher, etc. And getting those different perspectives is tremendously useful. And I think it's something a lot of people in STEM, historically myself included, have discounted as sort of being, we have our way of generating knowledge. This is the only true way. All other ways are useless. Um, when in actual fact, that's hugely arrogant and leads to some very poor decision making sometimes.
Yeah, uh, and the problem is also even trying to reach across quite often comes out as arrogant. Earlier today, I was reading an essay about history and what we can learn from history in order to say something sensible about the future, and it was written essentially by a historian of history, trying to explain where some of the people doing cliometrics and big history are coming from. And I felt my blood pressure going up more and more, because it felt like this is a traditional historian criticizing these people who are actually trying to turn history into something useful, to actually give us some forecasts or ways of reasoning
Oh,
about
sorry, keep
likely or
talking. I'm just gonna pop away, but I can still hear. Just need to get some
okay,
coke.
yep. But the funny thing was, of course, near the end, I realized, wait a minute, this is actually somebody trying to be helpful. It's just that it's expressed in a terminology that makes it sound to me as an outsider that they're just attacking all these other people, but actually trying to be helpful, pointing out some stuff they miss that traditional historians actually are quite aware of and actually does matter. But there is this weird irony that even helping can come across as heavy-handed. Most fields dread when the physicists show up and they say, "Oh, we can think we can solve this using a model." And typically that means that okay, they get a model and it might or might not be helpful, but the physicists believe that they understand what's relevant in the field, and nobody really likes that. Except, okay, of course, occasionally they actually do have some interesting ideas.
Yeah, that's the annoying thing about the arrogant physicists wanting in to completely reinvent the fields that nobody asked to be reinvented, is sometimes they do have a point. Not often, but occasionally they have a really good point and completely, make a major uh, contribution to the field. So you've got to kind of tolerate them, even though a lot of the time it's
And
really
this
annoying.
goes also for the kind of social studies of science people. Yeah, they're not trying to do physics. They're talking about the sociology of physicists. That doesn't necessarily mean that they claim that there are no atoms and electrons. But it certainly sounds like that, because they don't express themselves in the way we understand the hard sciences. So it sounds like they're kind of arguing for some kind of crazy relativism, but they're actually trying to make a point about how you go about in physics to establish facts and what you even think facts are. Now, the the problem here is, of course, that sometimes you do get people who just are trying to elbow in and think they know what they're doing, and sometimes it's very hard to do a critique because you don't have the terminology point out where they're totally going wrong. But still, it's one world. We're still kind of looking at different aspects,
Mm.
and sometimes very, very different ways of looking at the same thing. Sometimes actually different things we're looking at, but it sounds like we're talking about the same thing. But it's the same world we're talking about. And that's kind of important, at least the academics who try to be helpful rather than just further the career by writing some kind of weird poetry. Uh, I have some continental philosophers I have my doubts about, but then again, sometimes you discover that, oh, that continental philosopher, although his prose is very much like poetry, there are actually some really cool ideas about economics and ecology in there.
I had a similar thing not too long ago with a lot of postmodernist sort of stuff. I back in my I don't know late teens or whenever I was a big fan of the SoCal affair and ho these silly postmodernists all just making stuff up. They're just randomly generating these papers. Well, actually, there's a fair bit of good argument to be had there with regards to the fact that science is conducted within a social framework, and it's not this kind of pristine ivory tower where we're all thinking perfectly logical thoughts and generating these hypotheses and testing them out, and we're assigning our confidence levels in a rational. We're bumbling around doing human stuff and trying to apply a framework to it, which is, don't get me wrong, a fantastic framework. Science is our best, or at least has the best track record of any method for like generating new knowledge. But excuse me, it's difficult to deny that it's conducted by humans and those biases and so forth have an impact. Um, and yeah, it's easy to get hung up on the fact that other fields have their own way of talking about things, or even that other fields have a substantial number of kind of stupid writers in them who put out a lot of crap. But that doesn't discount the fact that the field has a lot to contribute.
Well, Sturgeon's law, which was originally, of course, applied to science fiction, is 90% of everything is crap. Let's face it,
Mm.
90% of academic papers are crappy stuff.
So
But
chinchilla
the
in
tricky part is, of course, can you tell what is crap?
mm,
In fields where you can't tell what's crap, then you're in trouble. So after the Sokal affair, where Alan Sokal kind of did a made-up postmodernist paper and got it published in a high-prestige journal to prove that they were not doing things here, there was the Bogdanov affair, where there was this argument about a theoretical physics PhD, whether that was just a Sokal done in the opposite direction. And the funny thing is, a lot of physicists have different views about whether that paper has merit or not. That is kind of disturbing if they can't even agree on whether it has merit.
physics, the hardest of sciences.
Yeah, but of course, theoretical physics, how different is it from postmodernism?
String
I
theory.
read some theoretical physics papers that I think might be almost getting into the same level, not just by fanciful terminology, but here, really cool concepts that have very, very weak connections to
Mm,
an observed reality. Of course, sometimes it does work out. Einstein did great with the general relativity, which in many ways abstracts away the reality we know and love so much to a very high degree, but actually does produce some testable outcomes. Unfortunately, a lot of theoretical physics doesn't even produce testable outcomes. It just produces really awesome papers.
mm. Fortunately, it's relatively cheap compared to experimental physics.
Yeah, of course, you could complain and say, look, the Large Hadron Collider, yeah, it found the Higgs boson, but it haven't found any supersymmetry. It haven't found any quantum black holes or that long, 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 long list of things that could have been found that people were bringing up in the 90s to motivate the project. In many ways, I think the discovery of nothing unexpected is really unexpected. I don't think anybody would have been betting on that. So in many ways, it's been super successful, except that most people would probably been happier if they just got some dark matter particles or got some really weird supersymmetric partner bosons. So now people have to actually do some serious thinking about what's actually going on in the standard model. This can't be everything there is, right?
Mm,
After all, it still doesn't explain the dark matter.
gravity.
We still have some weird problems with the neutrino masses. But the standard model is doing so well right
Mm.
now, which annoys everybody, which is a very fun situation.
Those theoretical physicists just want to break all their models so they can have a fun rethinking it all out and coming up with a completely new. I suppose each generation of physicists probably wants to kind of reinvent everything and demonstrate that they're the amazing pioneers and so forth, which goes
But
back what it's
it's
common
also
to.
so fun when you actually can do that. So if
Mm,
you look at the history of physics in the 20th century, so in 1900, people are doing the Michelson-Morley experiment. People are still thinking about the ether. It's clear that there are some problems. There is actually a talk by Lord Kelvin, some clouds on the sky of physics, where he points out that, yeah, things look pretty complete right now, but I have some misgivings about these weird things. We have trouble with the black body radiation. It doesn't seem to work out mathematically as we would like. There is that thing about the ether. And yes, just 5 years later, Einstein comes onto the scene and the quantum people show up. And then for about 20 to 30 years, they build essentially all of what we have in relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and even get in fairly deep into quantum field theory. That is that is just one generation, and they get to invent it all from maybe light is quantized over to the Schrödinger equation over to Feynman diagrams. This is astonishing when you look at how deep a lot of that physics is. And I think many of us have totally the same envy. Just imagine being in a period like that. Even if you're kind of relatively mediocre, you're going to get a few theorems and things named after yourself just by sheer virtue of
yeah.
being there.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like, reading the histories of it, that there were these absolute giants walking the earth, all of whom had this overwhelming cognitive potential. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure a lot of these guys were extremely smart, and certainly, like Fermi was particularly noted as having been, one of the smart, like a true wizard kind of thing. Um, but yeah, you do have to kind of wonder whether some of them just got a bit lucky.
Mm.
We're in the right time and
I think
place.
this is true for a lot of science. A lot of the theorems named after somebody, well, they picked a low-hanging fruit. The trick is, of course, you want to be in there when the gate to the garden opens and rush in and grab one or two of the fruits, and then you get your name on it. Or sometimes you can even buy it. L'Hopital's rule in calculus, for example, was actually bought by L'Hopital from one of the Bernoullis.
Oh, that's real fuck you money when you get to be able to buy mathematical principles.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of naughty, and many people felt that's probably not really the ethics of
Yeah.
what this ought to be about.
Though they do it with some animal species. A fair bit of conservation efforts have been funded by. There's the what golden something or other oh, Golden Palace. I can't remember. There was a casino website. There we go. The Madidi Titi is a monkey known as the Golden Palace monkey, uh, named after goldenpalace.com, who sponsored it, or who paid for it to be named that. And I think the money went towards, quite a lot of conservation efforts, which 650,000 to name the monkey species. That's not bad for a primate species, actually.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, th- there are not that many primate species. I
No,
mean,
exactly.
beetles, they're dime a dozen. There are millions of them. The going price for a beetle can't be that high. But a monkey, yeah. And also the name Golden Palace Monkey, it even sounds really cool.
I know that is quite good. The Chinchilla in chat has brought up regarding our kind of point about people being the right time. There's a theory about the time propelling certain people, like Napoleon is product of his time, considering he's such a random person to claim so much power at the time. And yeah, I think that this is kind of an ongoing, uh, not so much rivalry as but tension in history between um, kind of determinism of the period versus the like great man theory, where all history is great men doing huge strident things. And I think most scholars these days tend towards the former. Um, like pretty much everyone can agree that Newton was, a very impressive genius. But calculus was invented independently, I think at least three times. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah,
I'm really fond of an argument Jason Crawford had on his Roots of Progress blog. That blog is about trying to do progress studies. And he pointed out that every time he brings up an invention, somebody is going to bring up a precursor. Somebody else usually had that invention
mm,
before the inventor he
mm,
brings up. And his response is, yeah, but Edison, he might not have been first to make a light bulb, but he was the first one who could make money from it and actually sold it. And all our light bulbs are, in a very real sense, descended from his light bulb.
mm,
There are earlier systems that people came up with that's called demonstrations, or demonstrated it at court, or even filed a patent, but nothing happened. What really matters is what you can build on. And I think the tricky part here is that that is a mixture of both the great man and the time period. Calculus, people have been kind of coming up with precursors for a very long time. And indeed, Leibniz was doing it at the same time
mm,
as Newton. But both Leibniz and Newton created systems that could then be applied for other stuff. Archimedes and I never remember the name of his Chinese counterpart. Uh, they came up with it as a genius solution for one problem and then left it at that. So when it comes to science, you have these weird effects that you also get clustering, because smart people tend to attract other smart people, and then they
mm,
bounce ideas off each other. So when you actually look at their frequency in space and time, you tend to find places like 1920s Vienna, where it's an awful lot of geniuses who all go to the same cafes and chat with each other. It turns out that half of the physicists at the Manhattan Project had been to the same Hungarian high school. That's kind of what was going on in that physics lectures. Indeed, one of the running jokes at the Manhattan Project was that there were probably some time travelers or aliens who'd be kind of spreading very good genes around Budapest a few years earlier. Um, so you have this clustering effect, which means that it both looks very much like the time period, But you also have these people who are also very smart and bouncing things off each other. And of course, probably also having a lot of grad students and people working for them that actually get to implement stuff. So I think the lumpiness of history is really interesting. I would love to see a better theory of that. I want to
Mm.
kind of run simulations. I want to calculate the Lyapunov exponents to see how chaotic it is, and see what if we have an impulse? What is the response here? Can we say something about like that, like we would like to say about a physical system? The
Yeah,
problem is we don't have that kind of tool yet.
that's something that I've always been fascinated by the thought experiment of being able to just run history over and over and see, okay, if I time travel back here and tweak this a little bit, part of me hopes that the many worlds interpretation is true and that we can travel through worlds. We probably can't, but if we could, that would be very fun because one could
Yeah.
go back and see all the tiny little butterfly wing flaps that are propagating.
And then you can write a paper. 9 out of 10 Einsteins agree on this.
I don't know if you've read. I assume you've read some Neil Stevenson. His fairly recent book, The Rise and Fall of Dodo, is kind of about this. It's a sort of quasi-realistic look at time travel, um, but dealing with the kind of propagating unintended consequences, and it's a cool take on it, and has
And
appropriate.
I think it's also an important question, actually. It's not just thinking backwards, it's also how much do our actions matter for the future? So
Yeah.
if history is very much the big patterns, is if it's pretty independent on the individual actions, in that case, what we're doing is not going to have much of an effect.
Hmm.
We are not likely to do anything, even if we manage to get our name onto a theorem or get a Nobel Prize.
Someone would have
We're
come up
not,
with it in 5 years anyway.
yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if history is really divergent, then it might also be very hard to control the future because I might be trying to push it in some direction, but it's going to go off in whatever direction in a totally chaotic way. It might also be that it's somewhere in between and we have a chance to control history or influence it if we know what we're doing. Which of course raises both the question: can we know what this is going about? Can we know where to intervene? And do we have a wisdom to actually do the right intervention? But knowing more about this would actually really, really matter.
Yeah, and it's something that there hasn't been a lot of study of in the kind of in the focus sense of uh, trying to figure out the long-term effects of our actions in an actual practical way rather than just vaguely thinking about what possible outcomes there could be. Um,
But this might be an area where actually looking at history might be helpful. We
mm,
might actually want to trace some random events and see how long did the repercussions go. Can we say something about the shape of the repercussions? I think it's still very tricky. Counterfactual history is very debated among historians,
mm.
but sometimes you can just look at a chance event and see if you can compare and things around it.
I think that's potentially quite a nice kind of coda to round off on. We've kind of come full circle a bit there, and
Yeah, it all hangs together.
absolutely, which we entirely planned. Honestly, this is all scripted and carefully planned out. Well, thank you very much indeed, Anders. You are a true friend of the show, and I always appreciate having you on, but especially when I email you last night saying, "Do you mind giving me a hand with this argument?" And you come and spend two
Yeah,
hours
except that
chatting.
I'm not certain I've been helpful here. Just been giving you a lot of more stuff.
Oh no, that's always helpful. It's how our conversations usually go, and I always like to take a bunch of notes. Gives me interesting things to go off and think about, and to round out my argument, and particularly the Schleffer's work on future generations. I'm going to go off and read, and I think that's probably going to provide some rather useful information. So thank you for that, and more importantly, thank you for chatting with me for nearly 2 hours because you are a like serious active academic doing very important work, and it's really touching to me that you're willing to spend good chunk of
Well,
time just
I'm
chatting.
learning stuff too here. So thank you and live long and prosper, stay
Indeed.
safe and so on.
Au
Yeah.
revoir,
Cheers.
Anders. Have a good
Yeah.
evening.
Au revoir.